All right, welcome back to the AI for Retail Summit. I hope you're having an amazing time so far. Our next speaker is Jake DiBattista. He is a user researcher and strategist at Sam's Club. Please join me in welcoming Jake to our virtual stage.
Hello, everyone. Nice to be here today. So my role at Sam's Club is as a UX researcher and strategist, as I was just introduced. I work mainly on the innovation team. Today, I'm really going to be talking a lot about how UX can impact machine learning and the role I see as far as product development for UX in machine learning. So first, to just kind of get a little bit of a ground leveling here, I'm going to talk a little about what UX is. So I think that the term gets thrown around a lot now, and there's a lot of misconception about exactly what a user researcher does or exactly their value in the product development process. So I'm going to give you my perspective. I think that everyone has their own little twist on the term, but as far as we approach it and how I approach it, I think that this is accurate to what we do and how I develop products on our innovation team. So when I boil it all down, it all comes down to conversation. So my role really on the team is to be the voice of the customer and have those conversations early and often. When you're developing products in AI and machine learning, they can be very technical, and a lot of it could be just kind of trying to optimize for what would be best for the product state. But really what my job is to kind of get in there early before maybe launch or when you're still in ideation and really say, okay, like, why are we building it this way? Or what would be the best way to approach this from a customer lens? So that when you get to the end of the finish line, there's not so much of a shock or a assumption of what will work. You already kind of have it validated and tested. So my role is really to have those conversations and to drive those. So you might be wondering why these conversations matter. A lot of you probably are developers or in the data space. So, why does UX matter and what can we do and what value can we add to your team? So I'm sure this kind of gets brought up a lot today or in this space, and that's the Target case. For a quick recap, uh, you know, Target was able in the early 2010s, 2012, I believe, to actually learn and predict which customers of theirs would need pregnancy products, diapers, things like that. And they got so good at it, they started doing mailers out to kind of preemptively target and advertise to those women which had become pregnant. So I think that the reason this got such bad press from a UX perspective wasn't because the underlying technology was bad. In fact, I'm sure a lot of the underlying technology is still used by them and as well as other commercial retailers. I think the UX is what was bad or missing from that piece. Why did we send the mail out? What should the mail be said? Who should be getting the mail? Those were all questions I think could have been answered earlier to have a greater adoption and kind of fight that negative feedback they ultimately got and pulling that statement back. Let's look a little bit about where we're at right now with public sentiment. As you can see at the top here, Facebook actually has the lowest, it seems like, public trust, as 68% of Americans now believe that Facebook is spying on them. This has resulted in some pretty staggering statistics. In fact, 40% of TikTok users have deleted the application in the past year. So, if people like lose trust in your app and think you're spying on them or using predictive analytics or AI in a weird way, they will react and there will be a public sentiment. And I think that UX really works to kind of shape and kind of form positive public sentiment and positive experiences so that you don't have this negative press or you don't have these negative download scores. And that's because people shop with their feelings. Perception is reality. Now, if you kind of go back a slide here, I'm sure many of these companies kind of have equal, if not differing levels of quote unquote spying going on or predictive analytics going on. And in fact, Google probably has the greatest level of insights into their consumers. But the perception really dictates what's going to happen here, whether people are going to elite and use your product. It doesn't so much matter what you're actually doing. What matters is what they perceive you're doing or what's their experience on your product. So how you package that and how you utilize it in the markets is what I think UX can really help to shape. So what kind of business outcomes can be tied to UX? I talked about a couple of use cases here. So let's talk about actually what we do and what I do on the job. So first and foremost, I think that I am the voice of ethics a lot of time. And that's not to say developers or data scientists aren't ethical, but that's more so to say that through UX, you can really build an ethical brand and a brand people trust. A lot of questions I do won't be, so much, do you prefer blue shade or red shade, but more so like what values do you prefer in a company? Or if we present data this way, does it violate some form of trust or some expectation you have? So really working for ethics is a great, utilization of UX in this process, and testing ethics of your users, really understanding where they stand and not making those assumptions. We also work with adoption. So saying, taking a user through flows and optimal states and saying, would you try this? Why wouldn't you? If they're willing to trust you, they're more willing to buy you. And I think adoption directly ties to trust and that optimized user experience and design. So getting those in front of the users early and asking those questions early can really help with adoption. And lastly, regulation. I know regulation really is kind of seen as like a black and white thing. You can do this, you can't do this, but often with disruptive technologies, regulation is still forming. So, user sentiment really is regulation in some ways. So UX provides regulation where there is none is kind of a value we have and I have. And I think that what that means is that essentially, if you don't know if something's right or wrong, or if there's not a clear law, which in a lot of new tech there might not be, what would the users say? Like at the end of the day, do they feel like you're doing something wrong? Like, do you feel like you're violating something? I think UX really can test that and kind of create a path when there is none, or at least create some nice rules for you to play in, just so that like when you're building, like this is something a tenet that is important to users and that we shouldn't be violating. So now that I've kind of talked broadly about UX and why it's important, let's talk about like kind of my approach and how I work on products in the AI space, or more specifically, the machine learning space. So UX in a nutshell comes down to 3 steps. I think this is oversimplifying it, but I didn't want to get too crazy because, again, we can only consume so much in this session. So let's start with these 3 principles. 1, we work to define the problem. 2, we engage stakeholders. And 3, we test solutions. So what does defining the problem mean? From a UX perspective, defining the problem isn't so much a raw, like this 50 goods needs to get to this bucket. It's really what is the underlying problem? Why does it need to transport there? What's going wrong? So it's really kind of digging deep and questioning a few layers into that why, so that when you're designing a solution, it's not surface level or just a band-aid, but actually works to kind of rebuild trust or build a new ecosystem or experience. So UX should ideally be on kind of bigger problems and kind of be used from a bigger scope where you're going in with less assumptions or less kind of expectations and requirements already. So for example, I might come into an engineering team and decide if they're solving for an engineering problem, like re-optimizing a database or an algorithm, or if they're solving for an actual user problem. And if it's a user problem, I'll stay on. If it's an engineering problem, you probably don't need UX research as much. Why is the problem occurring? So often teams think that they need to solve for something, but they kind of miss the mark. So for example, they might think shoppers want to spend less time in line, but really what they need is less time in the store. And that might be a completely different metric or way you approach the problem, or you approach how you're delivering them data or things like that. So really digging into that why. And then last, is AI and ML the solution? So I think a lot of teams I work with see the newest, hottest tech and they want to use it. And that's great. I love using new techs and figuring out how they can improve the world. But I think that, before you jump the gun, the solution, determining if it is the right solution is something UX can help with, and kind of starting broad or taking kind of a wide lens approach before, again, you get more granular. I think that's really the role of UX when defining the problem. I think UX should be engaging stakeholders, whether it's end users like shoppers, whether it's store associates, whether it's executives that need to make these decisions and approvals. I think UX should kind of be talking to all of them. I think they should be figuring out where the trade-offs are, where there might be ethical violations or what's making them uncomfortable. I think these are all great questions depending on the project that a UX researcher can get involved. Again, providing that regulation when there is none is a great use for a UX researcher in the AI ML space, and figuring out like what the trade-offs are. Not so much from a pure business perspective, but maybe like a usability perspective as well, and weighing those all together. And then last, we test solutions. So we test kind of if the lift is worth the gain, the pain is worth the gain. Saying, okay, we're going to have to ask the user to do this much more, or they're going to give us this much more data. Is it worth it? I think a lot of times in machine learning or in AI, it's a lot about the users giving up rights or giving up data sometimes to get, convenience, to get something tailored to them. And when you think about it, it's like that is a trade-off. It might seem like, hey, you're doing nothing and you're just getting positive, but they are making a sacrifice. And I think it's worth informing them of what that sacrifice is and making it really clear and easy to understand that, with this privacy, violation, or with this, this new code we're running, you're going to get this and you're going to get Y, but in return, you get Y. I think kind of testing it at that level is something that doesn't really happen enough. It just either, we're testing at the business level, but we're not really breaking it down and making it understandable for people. And I think that's something we should do more of and that UX can help with. We also can help them understand, obstacles we're creating, or what, this new predictive analytic or machine learning might do. So if you're using a chat bot, for example, do you have to now like talk to this thing to do a task where previously you could just walk and get it done? We always have both options. What's going on there exactly. And, I think the biggest thing with UX is figuring out how to test quicker and more cheaply before you go down the road. I think my ultimate business value add often is, you have this great idea, this great technology you want to invest in. What's the bare minimum we can test it at? Or what parts of it or assumptions can we test before we roll it out as a whole? Can we get 50 customers to give us, positive sentiment feedback? Can we, put a simulated version of it that's not real AI or machine learning, but kind of at least test the trade-offs and what it could be before we do the full build? So I think those are great ways to get in front of the customer faster before you need to like collect vast reservoirs of data, or really kind of go full throttle with collecting things that they might not consent to or not knowingly consent to. So let's talk a little bit about, what we do here at Sam's Walmart. Again, these are my opinions and my experiences. I'm not speaking on behalf of the company fully here, but we have done quite a bit of testing about what could happen in a store, making a store more sensor driven, more scannable, more interactive. There are some, mixed results. I'm not going to go into specifics, but I think for the most part, it's important to know that, navigation and getting through a retail experience is still very physical. So, think about that. Think about, the mom and kids running around the store. Does this make her life easier? Does, all of these, applications, smart recommendations, pathing, is it actually the best way to do it? Is the data good enough? Are we going to have to kind of just like guess at some points that are going to ultimately turn off the user and then they won't even try it, for years? Are we ready for this? Because, I think, a lot of these things work well in the lab, but you get to scale, or you get to a part where only 30% of the people in store might be using the application or something like that. And it starts to break because there's just not enough data, or the data is, processing poorly or not fast enough. It's a remote area. So just being smart about, how we kind of roll this out, I think is a huge thing. And at what scale we do it, what mediums we choose. I think all of that's going to be super important when looking at the future of retail through an AI lens. And some of our early tests, to be frank, I don't think that it is super kind of ready to go live as far as like a B2C, a consumer experience, where the B2B might be much more easy to run. So I always liked, as a UX person, I think B2B is cool, and I do work on those projects, but I always do think, end of the day, what is a real shopper experiencing, or what is a real member experiencing when they go through some of this new tech, or through some of this that we've developed. So I'll kind of wrap up here today by talking a little bit about what I like and where I think that this tech has a lot of potential in the near term based on what I've seen. First and foremost, I think that, blockchain offers a really good avenue to kind of move forward with this, whether it's, again, like a B2B, like using it for supply chain and getting smarter analytics and more predictive about how to route shipments, how to distribute, things like that. Or, even a consumer experience. So like, just, how can we see where products are being utilized and get those out there? I think blockchain is great because it's just knowingly public. Like, that data isn't something where, I didn't know that this company knew this about me, or I think this company might resell it. I think blockchain is designed kind of to work with this public infrastructure, and that AI can really kind of, like, the data sets kind of cater to AI. Now, they're much smaller data sets, so I don't know if like it will be as powerful. And sometimes I'm sure there's a level of encryption I'm not even aware of that maybe makes it harder to work with blockchain data in its current state. But I think that there's been a lot of promise that I've seen on both the B2B and the B2C end. So using it for supply chain management, as well as using it for in-store experience type things. And I think that there's a lot of potential here. And I think that's kind of where we'll be kind of, or at least I'll be kind of looking more into. Another use case that I really like it for that we did some research into was emergency. I think that like emergency response in store and providing emergency care and things like that. Anytime you have like a situation like this, where I would say that consent of rights is kind of outweighed by like need. I think that it's really important, to kind of look into leveraging AI or machine learning. So if for perhaps predicting in-store falls or things like that, if you can use this tech and you can kind of do it, I think consumers or shoppers are more likely to kind of consent in the emergency realm because, or even if it's employee training for, these situations, because I just think that this is a situation where it's not just, we talked about pain and gain earlier. This is a situation where there's a lot to gain. So the pain might, easily be outweighed. So I think that this is another example of an area where people knowingly are consenting or knowingly okay with intervention and machine learning kind of being more part of the puzzle. Where in other situations where if it's just really to drive business metrics, I'm not sure if a consumer is as willing to partake or give up rights or security or whatever it might be. So that's a little bit about my experience with the UX in AI and ML. Again, sorry I couldn't go more into specifics of actually what we are doing, but I do think this is a good like broad sense for how you should be using your UX team to kind of roll out these solutions and test early and often. If you want to learn more about my perspectives or things I've worked on, happy to kind of do a follow-up call. But this is my Twitter handle and email. So feel free to reach out to me, and thank you all for your time.
Amazing, Jake. Thank you so much for sharing with us. That was awesome. And I know this virtual audience is giving you a huge virtual round of applause. Thank you again for your time today. And for the audience, it's time for you to make your way to your next session. Along the way, make sure you accept your connection request and take some time to check out our awesome exhibits. Thanks so much, and we'll see you around.